Basil. The terrain changed shortly after leaving Safai, though the weather was just as wretched as it had been before they had arrived. Desolate plains with sweeping winds transformed into hills speckled with foliage, which morphed into squat mountains full of vegetation. When the company crested the first of the Shushui Mountains, Basil's gaze rose over mountain ridges receding farther and farther away. Each mountain had a broad peak, yielding a deceptive, elongating effect. Uneven tree branches, which had created the rugged skyline of each mountain, contributed to the illusion. The land dipped and bowed in ways that didn't make conceivable sense, as though the ground was malleable clay still being worked by a sculptor before the final version of the artwork dried. Although there hadn't been any additional attacks from the Bahantry, Basil continued sparring with Brucite after their evening meals. They only called off their practice sessions on nights when heavy snowfall pelted the camp. A week had passed since Safai, and Basil met with significantly fewer patients as the wounds from the Rhine Viaduct accident finally fully healed. A female soldier who had come to him for syphilum had stopped requesting his aid once he started inquiring about the origin of her bruising. He hadn't seen her around the campsite at all, and he feared the worst. When he asked his master if he had heard of any recent casualties, Master Watercress confirmed there had been an incident of a soldier whose tattered remains had been found. Her death had been deemed an accident. The Major General ruled that she had died from a beast's mauling. Though Basil didn't have evidence, he guessed he knew what sort of creature it was. He regretted that she hadn't told him what monsters had hurt her before they killed her. Without any leads, the perpetrators were free to continue stalking the campsite. The situation infuriated Basil, but he knew there wasn't anything he could do to change her fate. In the case of 9, the young enslaved boy who had his arm broken, Basil was also sad to see him go, but he was glad he was alive at least. The child had a curious mind and asked interesting questions that Basil had wanted to entertain. 9's healed arm also meant that Basil would not have routine opportunities to speak to his friends 5 and 18 any longer. Soon the caravan approached the land of the Carry people. It was the last part of Vetron before they entered into the kingdom of Ikasu. Even so, it was one of Vetron's largest regions. Personally, I have no interest in speaking to any Carry people or eating their bland food. I wish we would pass through the region without stopping in any of their crummy villages, Teleost complained one morning. T-15 tilted his helmet at the statement, but remained silent as ever. That would make your job easier. Have you ever been there before? Bruce had asked. No, but I know their reputation, Teleost said. Brucite and Basil exchanged a knowing look they made every time Teleost said something stupid or offensive. Their shared glances were becoming something of a shared joke. I have been entertained by Lady Androdite, Brucite said. She is a strong ruler. Their way of life is admittedly different than ours, but I would not say that their dwellings are crummy. Basil loved that Brucite had traveled to various places and provided insight into the different cultures. Teleost viewed the world as a dungy place, and Brucite's opinions gave Basil hope that they endured the freezing climate for something worthwhile. But they're a bunch of barbarians. It's not like they're going to have sewage or bathing houses as we do in civilized places like Sithica. Teleost, have you ever met a Carry? Basil asked, curious. No, but I could easily point one out. T-15 turned his head to face Teleost. Apparently his wails annoyed the silent soldier enough to make the gesture, but not enough to say more. Even so, the continuous gestures alone were monumentous for the expressionless suit of armor that marched next to them daily. Teleost, you have no idea what you're saying. The Carry roast the best meat I have ever eaten. They have the same infrastructure as all the other towns we've been to. I mean, would it kill them to hire a proper weather mage? Their region is known for having some of the worst weather in the whole of the 13 kingdoms. Don't remind us, Brucite grumbled. What had you been there for, Brucite? Another diplomatic trip? Basil asked. In a sense, yes. My father brought me out here for the lady's children to choose their future spouses. Unfortunately, they all chose descendants from other places. But it's tradition for the pairings to be selected early, so that the selected matches have time to adapt to the Carry's cultural norms. T-15 straightened. That's preposterous. Then again, what do I know of the politics that keep the regions operating as a cohesive kingdom? How old were you? Basil asked. 12, Brucite replied. I can't believe it's already been 10 rotations since then. That's a fairly large slice of your lifetime. Are you so sure your memories are clear from so long ago? Teleos asked, cocking his head. Oh, yes. I developed my first crush on that trip. I wouldn't forget it. Brusite recounted with a smile creeping onto his face. One of the lady's children? Basil asked. Her second-born daughter, Brusite said. T-15 huffed. Brusite continued. Since the line of succession is through the female line, all of her daughters had fierce competition. At the time, I didn't understand that, so I left heartbroken. Basil sympathized with Brusite over the unrequited affections. Salafin was my first infatuation. I can't believe this is the first time I've thought of her since we left. Basil was pleased he had filled his time making memories with new friends rather than dwelling on her. In response to Brusite, Basil said, I'm sorry to hear that. He put his hand on his friend's shoulder comfortingly. Thank you, but it was a long time ago. The local priests helped me through grief reduction meditations. You mustn't have made a good impression on Lady Androdite if she didn't pick you, Teleos said. Perhaps we should distance ourselves from you while we're there. Basil shot him an angry look. Teleos, stop it. Brusite laughed. No, he's right. I failed to impress anyone. I didn't understand anything of their culture when I went, so I projected an air of chivalry my parents had instilled in me. But I was sorely mistaken with this crowd. I looked like a buffoon. Any one of them, down to the infants, could have killed me if they had tried. They probably still could, Teleos sneered. Some, maybe, but I have had the best formal training with a sword that Gem can buy. I can perhaps hold my own against a child. Basil caught T-15 paying attention to their conversation. He refocused forward again. Brusite sent a side glance toward the silent soldier. I've seen you practice with Basil, Teleos said. You'd do poorly in a real fight. There's enough trouble as it is. We don't need more. Basil tried to de-escalate the tensions between the two young men. I'll duel you any day, friend, Brusite replied. We'll see who wins. I'll take you up on that. Good. Uncomfortable silence encircled the group until first sunset. Looks like Asiel's completed another day looking over us, Brusite said after the celestial event. As if he's actually connected to that sun. Teleos rolled his eyes. You don't have to be like that. Like what? Sarcastic, spiteful, generally unpleasant every chance you receive. Teleos looked like he was about to protest the accusations, but he remained silent. Basil received the impression that Brusite did not want to have this fight right now, and Brusite did not push the topic further. Brusite hummed to pass the time. Basil remembered music's comforting significance for his friend, and he hummed along. Occasionally, the S-ranks in the line ahead of them joined in the merriment too. Is Brusite thinking of his mother? Does he imagine her singing around his family's seaside manor? I couldn't imagine Master Watercress carrying a tune, in the office or otherwise. Basil smiled at the preposterous concept. The horn sounded for the campaign to halt for the evening. The group scattered to retrieve their tents and supplies from the oxen carts. They set them up near one another close to the pile of logs. Soon the fire starters lit the fires, and the cooks prepared the evening meal. Camp established itself faster every evening, and Basil was grateful for it. The process improvements meant dinner came sooner, and in the forested mountains, the hunters that traveled with them to feed the crusade party had significantly better luck finding prey than when they were in the open plains. That night they feasted on tundra swans and thawed vegetables. The greens were so mushy and tasteless that Basil couldn't tell what they were. Brusite and Teleos couldn't either. When Brusite taught Basil post-dinner, Teleos stuck around uncharacteristically. Basil eyed Teleos, and T-15 also stayed. Ready for this? Brusite asked. Absolutely, Basil said, readying his stance with his borrowed longsword. The sparring match progressed as usual, with Basil and Brusite leveraging the weight of their blades to advance their blows while careful not to let the other sword catch them. Basil had learned how to perform the forms, but he was clumsy in his movements, still acclimating to the feel of the blade's weight and the agility of his own body. To finally win against Brusite, Basil had decided to introduce defensive magic into their fight. The apprentice had only known one tome on force field generation, but if he could surprise Brusite with a small barrier, It might snag him the win. He just needed enough time to establish a plan. Basil had whispered, Dandayastokairakni, when Teleost moved to strike Brusite with a thick log from the campfire pile. Basil swiveled the invisible summoned barrier between Brusite and Teleost, but the silent soldier tackled Teleost before Teleost even approached the invisible shield. Brusite turned toward the scuffle behind him. He tried to approach, but he collided with the shield in his immediate path. Brusite banged on the barrier until Basil consciously dropped it. T-15 wailed on Teleost, and it wasn't until Basil and Brusite heaved T-15 away that the silent soldier concluded the assault. "What do you think you're doing?" Teleost screamed. The restrained soldier broke free from Basil and Brusite's grasp, then promptly scampered away from the three young men. Brusite sent an uncertain gaze after the soldier. "Teleost, what are you doing?" Basil demanded. "I was going to show Brusite how to fight," Teleost said. "Lie in wait until an opportunity arises." "Some opportunity? Have you no honor to attack a man while his back is turned? Or is it that you do not have enough courage to face me head on?" "I could win against you any day, but why risk an injury if I can prove my superiority without it?" Brusite attempted to pursue Teleost as he withdrew from the fire toward his tent, but Basil restrained him, muscles ready after controlling their silent friend. "I want to punch him in his unseemly square jaw. I can't believe we got placed on the back lines with the likes of him." Basil shrugged. "You can't choose who you march with. Just gotta make the best of the situation you're in." "You can choose. I don't know why you stick around. If it were me, I would have left. The day you spent in the oxen cart with your blacksmith friend, I thought we'd seen the last of you." To be frank, D4 assigned me to march along the back lines. But Brusite, you're my friend too. I want to be here. Besides, Billet may know how to sharpen a sword, but he doesn't know how to wield one. Where else would I learn how to fight? "I see how it is," Brusite said. After a pause, he continued. "I don't understand Teleost. If he didn't like us, why does he keep eating with us in his free time? Why does he set up his tent near us? Why does he bother to keep conversation with us?" "Perhaps he doesn't know how to be a friend?" "There's no way you can heal him, is there?" "Of what, being an ass? There's no cure for that. No herb can stimulate empathy production, although there are complications that could prevent it." The idea gave Basil pause for a moment. Worth a shot. You want to keep practicing?" "The evening sermon is starting," Basil said, glancing toward the priestess. "Tomorrow?" "Yeah." "Are you going to stick around for it tonight?" Basil asked. "Maybe for a bit. Then I'll meditate until I get tired. Nearly getting into a fight with Teleost wound up my nerves." Basil nodded, and the pair migrated from their small dinner fire to a massive crackling blaze. The flames were more than enough to warm Basil through to his bones. In the distant wood, a beastly Mara's howl wailed into the night. Recision had been in attendance with 5, 18, and 9. Otherwise, the faces were unfamiliar soldiers. The priestess Faith set up for her service. For her fragile frame, she effortlessly moved crates into place before climbing atop them. "We proclaim our faith," the priestess said before reciting. "Beginning from the age of the lonely to this unnamed age, angel and demon spawn have lived and walked among us to judge the worth of our souls upon their mortal death. The fate of one is the fate of all. And because of this truth, we live the best we can, so that the spawn will take away our suffering and death, to leave us in blissful peace for all eternity. The fate of one is the fate of all. Acts of cruelty to the spawn inspires fear, for the actions of one can doom the masses to writhe in spiritual agony for the rest of time. The fate of one is the fate of all. Upon this truth, we vow to one another to follow the lessons of the archangels and to learn from the mistakes of the archdemons. From Vantume the conflicted, to make the right choice when facing temptation. From Leilila the fair, to be the light that you wish to see in the world. From Losihe the generous, to give when you have much and nothing to gain. Brothers and sisters, we gather this night under the moons Fonte, Layla, and Lose, named in veneration of the 3 female archangels, Fonteme, Leila, and Losihe. Although Lose has yet to rise, Losihe watches over us still, as all the archangels do, regardless if we can see their light or not. On cloudy and stormy nights, it is hard to remember the light that shows us through the darkness, but all it takes is the patient passage of time for the suns to present themselves again. This is true not only in life, but in the people in our lives. Basil and Brucite exchanged a pointed glance to one another, clearly thinking of Teleost. Again tonight, we pray that the weather permits us safe passage as we travel across the countryside. We pray that there will be enough food and water to sustain us. We pray that the spawn in the north are safeguarded, and we pray that the Reisigli cease their attacks. If anyone has any other prayers to add, they may be added now.
I pray for M8. May he find peace in Safai. I pray for my wife and children. I pray for warmth through the Kerry regions.
Basil had never prayed for any of the patients he had lost before, but he felt compelled to this time. I pray for the butchered female soldier. He felt guilty that he didn't know her name, and he couldn't recall her rank fast enough. When he thought back to her treatments, he could see her armor and the ribbons clearly. T-51. I pray for T-51. Believers released additional prayers to the wind. Most kept their heads down, but the slave child 9 darted his gaze around camp. Basil tried to see what he looked at, but there was nothing. Perhaps 9 is a sorcerer watching a ghost. No, that's impossible. He would have been taken from Rescission and apprenticed under a mage if that had been the case. But what is he doing? The short service concluded with a guided meditation for fear reduction. Brucite left to focus on a different style of meditation in his tent. The walkthrough wasn't helpful, but there also wasn't much Basil feared. He assumed he'd have had many anxieties, but studying fighting techniques with Brucite alleviated his concerns. Despite the horrors, Basil was rather enjoying the adventure. At the end of the service, Rescission approached him, flanked by his slaves. The pious slaver had been an enigma to Basil. Everything about him was a contradiction. He had too much hair on one side of his head and hardly any on the other. Short mustache hairs sprung from his upper lip without the rest of the beard. Even his eyes couldn't make up their minds, with one being a light amber and the other being a dark bronze. His asymmetrical face matched his personality well.
Nice night for the service,
he said familiarly.
Basil wondered what made Rescission think they were friends.
Indeed, I appreciate Faith's teachings. Basil noticed a bruise on 9's freckled cheek as his gaze swept from Faith back to Rescission.
Too much love preaching makes men weak. There's something to be said for a good balance of fear and forgiveness.
Balance, is it? The viaduct wasn't enough for you? Basil asked with a light tone but a flat expression.
I mean spiritual distress. It does good for the soul to doubt what's going to happen after your spawn dies and you cease to exist as a ghost.
I agree with you on that, Basil said, just to be amiable. Yet, judging from the child's distressed expression, he wondered if he shouldn't have indulged the man. I want to help 9, but I don't want Rescission to know what I'm doing. Leveraging the sociable air of their conversation, Basil added, By the way, have you been marching toward the back of the Crusade pack?
With the other merchants, yes, Rescission acknowledged. Why do you ask?
5 and 18 stared at Basil quizzically, but said nothing in the presence of their owner. It looks like your slaves may be coming down with frost sickness. You can tell by their ashen complexions, Basil said. I'll treat them for free in the spirit of Losihe the Generous, but in the future it might be wise to stick closer to the line of soldiers so that you'll be guaranteed to be within my master's health barrier. Additionally, extra layers for warmth also ward off the sickness. 9 stared at Basil with large, slightly narrowed eyes.
Thank you. I can tell you're a strong brother of the faith. As one myself, I would not snub your generous offer and risk offending the lovely archangel.
Basil whispered the spell to reduce the swelling in front of each of them, but only meant the words when he treated 9. There was a difference between merely reciting the words, Sudayath kala vaya higon, bivayath higon kala ru kwayath sokraut, and recalling all the feelings and underlying scientific teachings in the spell tome while saying each word. Soon the bruised tenderness disappeared from Nine's face. "Thank you for your kindness." Nine took Basil's hand between his, and Basil assumed he understood what he had done. "I expect you all will fare better closer to the soldiers." Basil squeezed the child's hand before letting it go. He wished he could do more, but lying to their owner to reduce the child's pain would have to be enough for now. "May the light of Layla guide your nights." Recision headed to his own set of tents. "And may Akko brighten your days," Basil replied the traditional response. The process of faking an illness for his friends gave Basil an idea to do the same to Teleost in the morning, to see if there was something medically wrong with the relentlessly cynical soldier. Basil finally returned to his own fire. Crusade engaged in a one-sided conversation with T-15 as Basil approached. "I don't know why you don't interact with Basil and me. We've saved each other several times, and your reaction to Teleost today further proves that you at least care a little. We march next to each other, we eat together, we protect each other. Surely you feel some degree of camaraderie." The bronze suit of armor stood still. "Then what is it? Is it Teleost?" The bronze soldier shook his head. "What then?" Brucite questioned. "Safety," the soldier answered abruptly before leaving for his tent. Basil had always assumed the soldier's voice would be low or gruff, but it wasn't. He almost hadn't believed that the sound had come from the man, but he respected the answer to Brucite's question, even if it wasn't meant for him to hear. Because of the answer, Basil wished Brucite would stop trying to coax the man into their circle. While it would be nice to have another opinion to back up against Teleost's, it wouldn't be worth risking the man's well-being. Would he be in danger by letting his relatively closest friends know his identity, let alone his face or voice? Perhaps he was a disgraced child from some noble family, and he didn't want Brucite to recognize him. Basil attempted to come up with additional possibilities, but his mind caught up with his body and faced exhaustion. Basil awoke from a dream where his mother taught him to make her special olive pesto sauce in the kitchens of Treeside Manor. The reverie replayed in his memory until the responsibilities of the day distracted him. He wore a small smile and appreciated the start to his morning. As was routine, he changed his clothes and packed up his belongings. Before he had even placed his gear in Boss New's cart, Recision pulled him toward his own. "The frost sickness has afflicted Nine further. Please treat him," Recision said. Basil nodded, curious what this was about. He waved at 5 and 18 as he passed them. When Basil looked inside Nine's tent, Nine was curled up in several blankets, shivering violently. Basil told Recision, "We shouldn't keep the tent open. I'll come out when I'm done. I can try a few other ideas on how to manage the sickness." Recision agreed and let Basil to his work. Casting Boneth Runra, Basil established a protective sound barrier around the tent. "Recision can't hear us, Nine. What's actually wrong?" "He can't?" "He heard me cast the spell to establish a sound barrier, but that's it. What can I help you with?" For a long time, Nine stayed silent. He sat up so Basil could see his freckled face and big eyes up close. An internal struggle waged within him as he decided what to say. "He treats me better when I'm sick." Basil pitied the boy, and he considered possible solutions. "I'm sorry he hurts you, but if you continue to fake an illness, I'll have my master treat you instead, and Recision might discover that you're lying." "I know." Basil wished he could help, but he didn't know how. He made to leave. "Can you just stay a little longer?" How can I say no? Basil settled back down. After a moment of quiet, Basil asked one of the questions that he had been wondering about. "What were you looking at during the service last night?" "I had been staring at the fire, but then the offshoots of flame set the forest ablaze. It must have been my imagination, but I saw it clearly. Why?" "I was curious," Basil said. If he had seen ghosts, then Basil could have Master Watercress claim him as another apprentice and save him from the slave's life as he had been. But since that wasn't the situation, Basil would have to think of something else. "Do you know how much Recision would sell you for?" What's the going price for your age group? He can't be more than 8 or 9 rotations old.
I don't know how old I am, but he'd probably settle for an old minecut. Then again, he's making an investment by raising me, so he might want the price of an adult slave. That would be a briolette cut, but he might be willing to negotiate that. Are you going to buy me? Will you be my new owner?
9 asked. If I can save the gem, then I'd like to try, but I'd be your teacher, a pseudo-master, not your owner. Basil assessed the small bag of gems he had amassed so far. It contained the equivalent of a baguette cut in shards, equivalent to 150 of the metal coins of the Far Kingdoms. An old mine cut would be 1,000 metal coins. A pear cut would be another 500. Together, an old mine cut and a pear cut would equal the briolette cut. Basil would have a long way to go to gather that sort of gem. I could do it by the end of the crusade, so long as I'm not cheated when exchanging shards for larger cut gems. 9 uncoiled from his sheets to hug Basil.
Thank you.
Basil hugged him back. Don't thank me yet. I still have to earn the gem. In the meanwhile, behave for rescission. I can't fake another sickness for you, but I hope he'll keep you warm enough during the journey. 9 pulled back with tears forming in his eyes, smiling the biggest grin Basil had ever seen on the child. I'll do my best.
Okay,
9 agreed.
Me too.
Basil removed the sound barrier and left the cramped tent.
Did you help him?
Rescission asked. He should feel better now. Basil left the man to investigate 9 for himself, as Basil picked up his supplies. Basil traded his tent for the crates of dried herbs, and he set up his mini healing station as he did every morning. Few visited him, and all were soldiers. If he wanted to earn enough to purchase 9, he would need an alternative way. Perhaps he could sharpen blades with billet, and in the towns he could sell his services rather than explore with the others. During the morning muster, Master Watercress visited Basil. How have you been faring? Basil avoided mentioning his promise to 9.
I've been well. I've been training with crusade still.
His master narrowed his eyes. And?
I attended face service last night.
And?
How does he always know? I might have told a slave I would buy him to save him from his owner's abuse.
His master adopted an astonished expression for a moment. I suppose I know how Annis felt when I told him I was taking you on as an apprentice, but what are you going to do with him, Basil?
Train him to be a wizard, I suppose, Basil said, as you taught me.
It will be much, much harder for him to learn than it was for you, Watercress warned. You grew up with the holy language from birth. He will be learning far beyond the prime rotations of his brain's language development center. Then perhaps I can teach him a number of other skills you taught me. See what he likes, and he can choose something for himself, Basil said. Is Watercress cross with me? To be clear, I'm not upset with you. I'm proud of you, and cross with myself for raising you in my footsteps.
Basil wasn't sure he liked that answer any better.
I wish I could have raised you to look out for yourself more, is all, Watercress said. If you are separated from the crusade, for any reason, I want you to realize what that will mean for him. Basil understood that his master's concern was in reference to King Citrine's assignment with the Oracle. I'll take him with me. I'm sure he's got plenty of skills that could be useful on the road. You probably can't read, Watercress reminded.
Other skills, non-academic skills. He travels often, so he should know the road.
I also suspect he's a prophet, but I don't have solid evidence of it yet. If his owner suspects the same, it would certainly mark up his price.
I'm not telling Rescission. I'm not an idiot.
Basil remembered one of his master's history books, which detailed the stories of the prophets of old. Prophets are supposed to be rarer than Arkspawn, fewer than one born per age in our history thus far. It's interesting that a prophet exists in the same lifespan of an Arkspawn. If 9 ever met Ether, he would be the only human free of fearing for his afterlife. For when prophets die, they can choose to endure eternity in the mortal world as an oracle. Of course, you're not an idiot. I made sure of that. Watercress smiled. Basil returned the expression. It looks like the muster's concluding. We should be getting to our positions, Watercress said before heading to the front of the line. Basil quickly packed up his supplies and met up with his friends. Precision and his slaves were within earshot of the back line. Basil nodded to the group as he passed them. Nine waved, and his old friends nodded back. Before Basil even reached the soldiers, he felt a wedge between Brusite and Teleost, colder than the glaciers they crossed. To break the silence, Basil interjected, Teleost, you don't look so good. I should examine you when we stop for the midday meal. My face is freezing, but I feel fine. Brusite raised a skeptical eyebrow, but refrained from replying. Basil assumed the conversation from the previous night weighed on his mind. I want to be sure. Besides, wouldn't you prefer to prevent frost sickness rather than suffer from it? I would wake you from your tent if I did, but I suppose that would still be more inconvenient. So it's decided then. Good. How were the patients this morning? Brusite asked. The usual. People get in fights with one another. They come to me. People suffer from indigestion. They come to me. People trip and scrape a knee through their fur trousers. They come to me. Basil was exaggerating, but it wasn't far from reality. But I am glad that the injuries from the viaduct have healed. Sure, that means less work for you, Teleos said. That wasn't what I meant. But it still holds true. Brusite pinched the bridge of his nose. He had evidently lost his patience before the march had even started for the day. You're right, Basil said, trying a new tactic. T-15 and Brusite both looked at him in a questioning manner. Of course I'm right. After the horn blew and the party crossed into the Carrylands, Brusite finally understood Basil's intentions. Hey, Teleost, Brusite tried. What? Were you still interested in learning the holy language? Sure, why? We don't have anything better to do while we're marching, and the forests of this place are spooking me, so the distraction would make me feel better. As soon as they had crossed into Carry territory, Basil had a feeling that the trees stalked them. It was probably the Carry people guarding their lands against defilement, but it unnerved him. Teleos grimaced at the woods surrounding them. Carry means warrior woman, Brusite explained, which explains their matriarchal structure. Sapphire typically has a weather mage installed there. It was named Joy, given that the improved weather provides a reprieve to travelers passing through the otherwise frigid land. Our neighboring kingdom of Ikasu means beautiful. Brusite's lessons carried on, naming towns and kingdoms he knew, and Teleos asked questions of his own. Anytime Brusite didn't know a word, Basil provided the translation. T-15 marched in his near-eternal silence, but Basil received the impression that T-15 enjoyed the conversation. What's demon? What's demon? Brusite shook his head. Scalthai, Basil said. Scalthai, Teleos repeated. How appropriate. Even though the session put Teleos in a temporarily better mood, he didn't exhibit the improvement that Basil had hoped for. He pursued his examination during their next meal. As soon as the horn blew to announce the midday meal, Basil brought Teleos farther away from the main group to sit on a fallen log on the edge of the forest. Have you had any pains recently? Basil started the exam as he would any other checkup. No, I told you this morning I feel fine. Okay, Basil said as he looked him over and checked his pulse. Because nothing was wrong from the physiological exam, Basil summoned a pool of spiraling energy to use for diagnostic purposes. The energy let Basil sense the internals of a body without having to cut it open, and also allowed him to guide healing magic rather than guessing or letting the magic run wild. Basil said, As I'm checking your neural pathways signaling, it helps if you recount a happy memory. It was entire nonsense. The spell did not rely on that level of specificity, but still, Basil was curious whether Teleost could muster a single positive sentiment. Like what? I don't know. About home? Basil added. Your mother, perhaps? That had seemed to work for Brusite. My home's overcrowded and my mother's cold. She's avoided me for rotations. Does truly nothing appeal to him? Basil tried to hold his exasperation from his tone as he tried again. Your father? My father is all right. Basil cocked his head. What's he like? He's the only one in my whole extended family who doesn't despise me. Did I prematurely get my hopes up? but Basil didn't interrupt.
He taught me to read before I joined the military, so I might earn a higher rank. He understood that I wanted more from life than what our family trade could give us. The rest of them scoffed at me, especially one of my wretched uncles. Telias scrutinized Basil. Are you sure you're doing this right? It feels like the magic's been sitting in the same spot and not doing anything.
That's normal, Basil lied. Amidst his inquiry, Basil had forgotten to shift the diagnostic magic around Telias' body to maintain his farce. As Basil moved the pool along Telias' spine, he released pent-up energy and helped Telias to relax. Once Basil glided the pool to his head, he sensed a significant growth in Telias' brain. Basil kept his composure as he dealt with the issue. If the growth had remained untreated, Telias might have had a rotation to live. He might have exhibited symptoms in time for Basil to address it, but he also might have randomly dropped dead. Sit as still as you can. I need to focus, Basil instructed. Telias blinked at him, perhaps in agreement to his terms, perhaps as a natural reflex. Basil couldn't tell which, but proceeded. He used the teachings of yet another spell tome, Viath Pon Sharai. He leveraged the spinning pool of energy to distinguish between what was growth and what was teleost. It took all of his focus to selectively kill the tumorous cells and leave the rest of teleost neurons in peace. The spell killed unwanted cells. It was the closest magic to combat wizardry Basil knew. That and how to make ice, but little frozen chunks didn't do much good in the middle of the Arctic tundra. The dead cells would filter out of Telias' body on their own, but Basil used the spell Namayeth to eradicate the mass. Something immediately changed in Teleost. Tears welled in his eyes. What did you do to me? Terrified something had gone wrong, Basil said steadily, I tried to heal you. I haven't felt happiness in... I don't even know. It's been so long. Telias struggled to speak through his overflowing emotion. I forgot what it feels like. Basil wondered if that were true, or if he had accidentally contorted Telias' personality. Given the size and state of the cancerous tissue, it might have grown over the course of many rotations. Oh, Basil, I've missed this feeling. His reaction was so extreme that Basil feared he would hyperventilate. Telias collapsed off the log, clutching himself. Telias' exultant cry attracted a few far-off glances. He pulled himself together, sat up from the ground, and looked to Basil. Thank you. I don't know what else to say. That's what I'm here for, Basil said, putting his hand on Telias' shoulder. Let's get some food. Telias smiled. It was the first one Basil had seen from him. Telias' temperament improved dramatically. In gratitude, he stole a weather-resistant pair of boots from the soldier supply stores for Basil. He also fished on occasion to supplement the evening meals when T-15 snuck out and returned without enough to feed everyone. Granted, he was the last to receive T-15's helpings, so he mostly fished for himself. But he shared when Basil or Brusite gripped their sides in hollow discomfort. He even delivered a few of his catches to a nearby campfire of soldiers who marched in the line before theirs. They had thinned and desperately needed additional rations. Brusite had joked with Basil, I guess you found a way to cure being an asshole after all. You must be the best healing mage of all time. Basil hadn't corrected him, and Teleost hadn't taken offense. They all knew he had been acting like a miserable wretch. T-15 relaxed, if ever so slightly, due to Teleost's change in disposition. While the soldier maintained his silence, the group spoke of childhood pastimes, discussed history, taught each other the holy language, taught each other how to fight, and expressed their ambitions. For Basil, the days flew, even when they trudged through the snowstorms. He acclimated to the weather, even as the conditions grew worse. As they neared the residence of Lady Androdite, to Basil's astonishment, T-15 joined their evening training. The short soldier glided through the motions of fighting. He was agile in every sense of the word, and he moved silently despite the difficulties of doing so with his metallic armor donned. Basil still didn't know the man's face, but he suspected a beast lay behind the mask. T-15 would only spar with Brusite. He outmatched the others, a fact Teleos conceded in his newfound humility. Basil wanted to test himself against the nimble soldier, though. He wanted to surprise him with his use of defensive magic during the fight, since Basil had failed to properly test it the last time. One night, he finally asked to fight T-15. The soldier looked at him through the eye slits of his helmet, measuring him. He stood. Basil nodded and backed a few paces away to let the man ready himself. Good luck, Crusade smirked.
Strike low, Telias advised. Destabilize him.
T-15 struck a stable stance with his longsword, and Basil mirrored him. They danced around one another cautiously. He moved first. Basil blocked the attack with his sword, as Brusite had taught him. T-15 tested him again with another basic form, then brought his sword in close as part of a defensive maneuver Basil was unfamiliar with. T-15 repeated the pattern of attacks, sliding into defense, testing Basil's ability to apply what he had learned with his evening lessons with Brusite. Annoyed, Basil played the game. He decided to put his barrier to use once he no longer recognized the forms. Their feet shuffled snow as the play fight droned on.
Telias yelled, Go for it, Basil! Rush in!
Basil had no intention of following Telias' guidance, but instead awaited the next attack patiently. T-15 feigned low, as Telias had suggested, then aimed for Basil's throat. Once again, Basil successfully blocked the blow. It was a move that Brusite had not prepared him for, but his reflexes were quick enough anyway. During the next strike, Basil decided to use the shield. Without moving his lips, he whispered, Dundiath Stokairakni. The strike came earlier than anticipated, T-15 attempting to catch him off guard. But Basil had cast the spell, and he was ready to place the simple temporary barrier wherever his mind desired. Nearly black eyes, with lengthy eyelashes, stared at him less than a step away. The eyes moved closer, set on winning their contest. Basil had his sword in front of him, but he wasn't prepared to block with it. He had been so transfixed on his opponent's eyes, he hadn't conjured the shield either. At that moment, when his opponent's full weight directed into the attack, he set the barrier in place. The moment after the soldier collided with it, he bounced backwards with a huffing noise. Basil leapt toward the soldier's fallen form and placed his blade at T-15's neck. Surrender, he said. The soldier kicked him in the shin, took his sword, and tickled both edges against his neck. Vreh. Basil didn't know what the word meant. It wasn't of either the holy or the common tongues. For a heartbeat, Basil wondered if perhaps an intelligent life form from one of Hagam's sister planets lurked under the armor. Then he remembered the intense human eyes and skin behind the mask. For marching with the man for so long, Basil could not believe he had noticed so little of his face. The soldier dropped Basil's sword by his side and took a seat where he had been sitting before the duel. It was worth a try. Basil reclaimed the practice sword. That was awesome! Where'd you learn that? Telias blurted. Master Watercress taught me a couple of defensive tomes. I can cast a small temporary barrier, but I can't, say, defend a whole town. I'll have to watch myself now, Brusite said. We've got ourselves a cheater. Using defensive magic isn't cheating, Basil said. In a sparring match, it is cheating, just like kicking a man in his stomach. Brusite sent a pointed glance toward T-15. Basil intended to incorporate the shield into fights and practice using it. He was not some lord who would fight for the entertainment of a king. Brusite could stick to the ethics of the noble knights. Basil wanted to return home alive.